I'm sitting by the window in the soft light of early morning, watching the pale sun stretch slowly across the floor. My name is Harold. I'm 79 years old. I used to wake up to noise phones ringing, traffic humming, people needing something from me. Now I wake up to silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask your permission, it just settles in and stays. There's a difference between choosing to be alone and ending up alone, and I learned that difference far too late. The house I live in still holds the shape of a life that used to be full. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 12 years ago. My brother died before that. Friends, one by one, faded out of my life like old photographs losing their color. My son lives in another country. My daughter calls occasionally, always in a hurry, always with something else waiting for her. I don't blame them. I raised them to be independent, to stand on their own feet, to never rely too much on anyone. I thought that was strength. I thought I was doing the right thing. Now I understand something I wish I had known much earlier. But by the time you truly understand certain truths, your life is already shaped by them. There's something I need to say, not because I think it will change your life, but because it deserves to be said while I still have the chance. Most people believe that life falls apart because of big mistakes, dramatic failures, terrible decisions. But that's not what I've seen. Most lives, including mine, aren't destroyed in loud, obvious ways. They fade quietly, worn down by safe choices, by decisions that seem reasonable at the time. Nobody warns you about that when you're young. They tell you to be careful, to be practical, to avoid risk, and those things sound wise, they sound responsible. But what they don't tell you is that a life built only on safety can slowly erase you. When I was young, I believed that being dependable was the highest form of love. I thought if I never caused problems, if I never asked for too much, if I kept everything running smoothly, that would make me a good man. I learned that early. I remember being a boy, maybe 8 or 9, sitting at the kitchen table while my parents argued in the next room. Their voices weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made me sit very still. I remember thinking that if I could just be quiet enough, good enough, invisible enough, maybe I wouldn't add to the tension. That maybe my job was to make things easier for everyone else. That idea stayed with me. It shaped how I spoke, how I acted, how I lived. I didn't demand attention. I didn't ask for reassurance. I didn't express fear or confusion. I handled things on my own because that's what I thought strength looked like. By the time I was in my 20s, I had become someone who was easy to rely on and hard to truly know. I met Eleanor when I was 25. She was kind, steady, thoughtful. I didn't fall in love in the way people describe in stories. There was no overwhelming feeling, no sense that I couldn't live without her. What I felt was comfort, stability. She made sense. And I had spent my whole life believing that making sense was more important than feeling deeply. So I married her. It seemed like the right thing to do. We built a life together. We bought a modest house. I worked as an accountant, a job that rewarded consistency and attention to detail. I showed up every day, did what was expected of me, and came home at the same time each evening. Eleanor kept the house running. We had 2 children. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it should. We were responsible, predictable, safe, and that was the problem. Everything was fine, not terrible, not painful, not broken, just fine. We didn't argue much because neither of us said enough to argue about. We didn't take risks because there was always a sensible reason not to. We didn't ask each other difficult questions because we didn't want to disturb the balance we had created. I convinced myself that this was what a successful life looked like. No chaos, no instability, no surprises. I told myself that excitement was for younger people, for people who didn't understand how the world worked. I believed I had matured beyond that. What I didn't realize was that I had confused emotional distance with maturity. I had mistaken endurance for connection. Years passed in a steady rhythm. Work, home, responsibilities. I watched my children grow up, but if I'm honest, I watched from a distance. I was there physically, but I wasn't fully present. When they came to me with problems, I offered solutions instead of comfort. When they expressed emotions, I tried to fix them instead of understanding them. I thought I was helping them become strong. In reality, I was teaching them to keep their distance from me. There was a moment, I remember it clearly now, when my son was about 14. He came home one evening upset about something that had happened at school. He sat across from me at the table trying to explain, his voice unsteady, and I interrupted him. I told him to toughen up, that life wasn't always fair, that he needed to learn how to handle things on his own. I thought I was preparing him for the real world. What I was actually doing was closing a door. After that, he stopped coming to me with anything that mattered. At the time, none of this felt like a mistake. That's what makes it so dangerous. It felt responsible, logical, necessary. I believed I was doing what a good father, a good husband, a good man was supposed to do. I didn't see what I was losing because the loss wasn't immediate. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated slowly, quietly, over years. In my early 40s, I was offered a position at work that would have changed my life in small but meaningful ways. It wasn't a dramatic promotion, but it came with new responsibilities, a bit of travel, a chance to grow beyond the narrow routine I had settled into. I remember the feeling when it was offered to me. A brief spark of something trust, maybe even excitement, and then almost immediately I shut it down. I told myself it wasn't practical, that my family needed stability, that it was better not to disrupt what was already working. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of failing, afraid of being seen, afraid of wanting something more than what I already had. So I said no, and I never thought about it again, or at least I told myself I didn't. Looking back now, I can see that my life wasn't shaped by a single decision. It was shaped by hundreds of small ones, each one reasonable, each one safe, each one taking me a little further away from who I might have been if I had allowed myself to want more, to feel more, to risk more. I didn't notice it happening. That's the hardest part to accept. There was no moment where everything fell apart, no dramatic realization. Just a slow narrowing of possibilities until one day I found myself living a life that felt smaller than the one I had once imagined. And the strangest thing is, for most of that time, I believed I was doing everything right. I believed I was being responsible. I believed I was building something stable and meaningful. I didn't realize that in my effort to avoid mistakes, I had also avoided something essential. Now, sitting here at 79 with more years behind me than ahead, I can see the pattern clearly. Not because I'm wiser than anyone else, but because time has a way of revealing what you couldn't see when you were in the middle of it. The choices that felt insignificant at the time were the ones that mattered most. The things I didn't say, the risks I didn't take, the emotions I didn't allow myself to feel, those are the things that shaped my life more than anything else. I'm not telling you this as advice. I don't believe advice has the power people think it does. We all learn in our own time, often too late to change much. But maybe hearing this from someone who has already lived through it might give you a moment of pause, a moment to consider whether the safe path you're on is leading you where you actually want to go or just where it's easiest to end up. because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. A life can look perfectly fine from the outside and still feel empty from within. And by the time you realize that, you may have already spent years, even decades, building something that doesn't quite feel like your own. The years kept moving the way they always do, quietly at first and then all at once. I didn't notice the distance growing between me and the people in my life because nothing ever broke loudly enough to demand my attention. There were no dramatic arguments, no doors slammed, no words that couldn't be taken back. Just a slow drift like two boats tied together with a rope that keeps loosening over time until one day you look up and realize the other has floated out of reach. Eleanor and I settled into a rhythm that looked stable from the outside. We knew each other's routines, preferences, habits. I knew how she liked her tea. She knew when I'd be home without asking. We functioned well together like two people who had learned how not to interfere with each other's lives. At the time, I believed that was harmony. Now I understand it was distance disguised as peace. There were moments, small ones, where something deeper tried to surface. I remember one evening, maybe 20 years into our marriage, we were sitting in the living room after dinner. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching. Eleanor looked at me and said very quietly, "Do you ever feel like something is missing?" I didn't even ask her what she meant. I laughed it off, said something about being tired from work, and changed the subject. I told myself she didn't really mean it, that she was just having a moment. The truth is, I didn't want to know what she meant, because I was afraid of what it might require from me. That was how I handled most things that felt uncomfortable. I redirected, I minimized, I convinced myself that ignoring a question was the same as answering it. And over time, those unasked questions became the foundation of our silence. My children grew older and began to build lives of their own. They became independent, capable, exactly as I had intended. But independence has a cost when it's built without closeness. My daughter moved to another city after college. I remember helping her pack her things into the car. We hugged briefly before she left, and I told her I was proud of her. It was a simple moment, one that should have felt full. But even then, there was something missing. A hesitation, a distance that neither of us knew how to bridge. We spoke on the phone occasionally after that, but the conversations were always practical. Updates about work, about health, about schedules. We never talked about fears or doubts or anything that required vulnerability. I told myself that was normal, that adults didn't need that kind of connection. Now I know better. Now I know that the absence of those conversations wasn't maturity. It was a consequence of everything I had taught her without realizing it. My son followed a similar path. He found opportunities abroad and took them. I encouraged him to go, to build his own life, to not feel tied down. I told him that was what success looked like, and in many ways it was. He built a career, a family, a life far away from the one we had shared. We speak even less often than my daughter and I do. When we do talk, it feels like speaking to someone I once knew very well, but no longer fully understand. At the time, I felt proud of this distance. I saw it as proof that I had done my job well, that I had raised children who didn't need me. It took me years to realize that not being needed is not the same as being loved closely. There's a quiet loneliness in that realization that's hard to explain unless you felt it yourself. Work continued in the same steady pattern. Numbers, reports, deadlines. I was good at what I did, reliable, consistent. But there was no sense of growth, no feeling that I was moving toward anything. just a continuation of what had already been established. I told myself that stability was enough, that wanting more was unnecessary, maybe even selfish. So I stayed where I was, year after year, until the idea of change felt foreign, almost impossible. There was a moment in my 50s when everything could have shifted, at least a little. A colleague of mine left the company to start something of his own. It wasn't guaranteed to succeed. In fact, most people thought it would fail. But he was excited, alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. He asked me once if I had ever considered doing something different, something that felt more meaningful. I laughed and told him I was too old for that kind of risk. He didn't argue with me. He just nodded as if he understood something I didn't. Years later, I heard that his business had done well. Not extraordinarily, but enough to give him a sense of ownership over his life. When I thought about it, I didn't feel envy exactly, more like a quiet awareness of a path I had never even allowed myself to consider. Eleanor's health began to decline in our later years. It wasn't sudden, it was gradual. The kind of change that happens so slowly you almost convince yourself it's not happening at all. Doctor visits became more frequent. Medications became part of our routine. I took care of what needed to be done, as I always had. Appointments, prescriptions, logistics. I handled everything efficiently, responsibly. But there was something missing even then. I didn't know how to sit with her in her fear. I didn't know how to talk about what was happening in a way that went beyond the practical. We continued as we always had, avoiding the deeper conversations, staying within the boundaries we had created over decades. One night, not long before she passed, she looked at me in a way she hadn't before. There was a kind of clarity in her eyes, something direct and unguarded. She said, "We were good at living, weren't we?" I nodded because it seemed like the right response. But then she added, "I just wish we had been a little braver." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing. That silence has stayed with me more than almost anything else. When she died, the house changed in a way that was immediate and undeniable. It wasn't just quieter. It felt emptier, as if something essential had been removed. I went through the motions in the days that followed. The arrangements, the paperwork, the calls. People came and went, offering condolences, sharing memories. I listened, nodded, thanked them. I did what was expected, and then they left, and I was alone. In that silence, something unexpected surfaced. Alongside the grief, which was real and heavy, there was another feeling, a sense of release. Not from her, but from the constant adjustment I had lived with for so long. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to consider someone else's needs before my own. I could sit in a room without feeling like I should be doing something. I could let the day unfold without a plan. That feeling confused me at first. It didn't match the image I had of what grief was supposed to look like. I felt guilty for experiencing it, as if it meant I hadn't loved her enough. It took me a long time to understand that both things could be true at the same time, that I could love her deeply and still feel the weight of a life where I had never fully been myself. The days turned into months, and the months into years. I began to notice things about myself that I had never paid attention to before. Small preferences, thoughts I had never allowed to fully form. It was as if I was meeting myself for the first time at an age when most people believe they already know who they are. But that discovery came with a cost. The realization that I had spent so much of my life living in a way that avoided discomfort, but also avoided depth. that I had chosen safety over authenticity again and again until it became my default way of being. I don't say this with bitterness. There's no anger left in me for the choices I made, only a kind of quiet understanding. I did what I thought was right with what I knew at the time. But knowing that doesn't change the outcome, it doesn't fill the spaces where something more could have been. Now, when I look back, I don't see one defining mistake. I see a pattern, a series of decisions that all pointed in the same direction, toward safety, toward predictability, away from anything that might have required me to confront myself more honestly. And the result of that pattern is not dramatic. It's not something you can point to and say, that's where everything went wrong. It's something you feel. In the distance between you and the people you love, in the conversations that never go beyond the surface, in the quiet moments when you realize you don't fully recognize the life you're living, that's the part no one prepares you for. Not the pain of failure, but the emptiness of a life that was carefully built to avoid it. Now, I sit here most mornings with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, watching the light shift across the same walls I've looked at for years, and I try to understand the life I lived without judging it too harshly. That's not as easy as it sounds. When you reach this point, you have two choices. You can either spend your remaining years replaying every decision, wondering what might have been, or you can learn to sit with what is, even if it's not what you once imagined. I won't pretend I haven't done both. There are days when the past feels very close, almost within reach. I can see the younger version of myself so clearly sometimes. A man who thought he had time, a man who believed that life would eventually open up, that there would be a moment when everything settled and he could finally ask himself what he truly wanted. I kept waiting for that moment. It never came. Not because it doesn't exist, but because I never made space for it. I filled my life so completely with responsibilities, routines, and expectations that there was no room left for anything else. That's something I wish I understood earlier. Life doesn't pause and wait for you to become ready. It moves quietly and consistently, and if you don't make deliberate choices, it will be shaped entirely by default. That's what happened to me. Not because I was careless, but because I was too careful. I avoided the risks that might have led to something uncertain, and in doing so, I also avoided the possibility of something deeply meaningful. But here's the part that's harder to admit. Even now, even with all this clarity, there's a part of me that understands why I lived the way I did. Safety is comforting. Predictability is reassuring. There's a certain peace in knowing what tomorrow will look like. When you grow up believing that your role is to keep things stable, to not disrupt, to not demand too much, that belief doesn't just disappear. It becomes part of how you see the world. So I don't hate the man I was. I understand him. He was doing his best with what he believed was right. But understanding doesn't erase the consequences. It doesn't bring back the conversations I never had, or the risks I never took, or the parts of myself I never allowed to exist. What I feel now isn't exactly regret in the way people usually describe it. It's something quieter, more constant, a kind of awareness, an understanding of how different things might have been if I had made even a few different choices along the way. Not all of them. I don't believe in rewriting entire lives, but small things, small moments where I could have said yes instead of no, spoken instead of staying silent, stayed present instead of retreating into what felt safe. I think about my children often, not with disappointment, but with a kind of distance that I helped create. They are good people. Capable, responsible, exactly what I encouraged them to be. But there's a formality in our relationship that never quite faded When they visit, we sit together, talk about the usual things, share meals, exchange polite affection, and then they leave. There's nothing wrong with it, not in a way that anyone else would notice. But I can feel what's missing. The ease, the openness, the sense that we truly know each other beyond the roles we play. I don't blame them for that. That distance didn't appear on its own. It was built slowly over years, through all the times I chose to be strong instead of honest, composed instead of vulnerable. I thought I was giving them stability. I didn't realize I was also teaching them how to stay just far enough away. There are moments, though, when something real still breaks through. My granddaughter visited me not long ago. She's young, still figuring out who she is. She asked me a question no one had asked me in years. She said, "Were you happy?" It caught me off guard, not because it was a difficult question, but because it was a direct one. The kind I had spent most of my life avoiding. I didn't answer right away. I thought about everything that question contained, the years, the choices, the quiet compromises, and I realized that the answer wasn't simple. I wasn't unhappy. There was no great suffering, no dramatic hardship. But I also wasn't fully alive in the way I might have been if I had allowed myself to feel more, to want more, to risk more. So I told her the truth as gently as I could. I said, "I had a good life, but I think I could have been braver." She nodded as if she understood something important in that moment. Maybe she did. Maybe she'll remember that conversation one day when she's faced with a choice between what feels safe and what feels true. That's all I can hope for now. Not to change my past, but to offer something useful from it. Not advice exactly, just perspective. A glimpse of what happens when a life is shaped more by caution than by courage. As for me, I've started making small changes even now, not because I think they will transform everything, but because it matters to me to try. I say things I would have once kept to myself. I reach out even when it feels uncomfortable. I allow myself to sit with emotions instead of pushing them aside. These are small acts, almost insignificant compared to the years that came before, but they feel meaningful in a way I didn't expect. I've learned that it's never entirely too late to become more honest with yourself. It may not change the past, but it changes how you experience the present. And at this stage of life, that's something. There's also a kind of peace that comes with acceptance, not the kind that pretends everything was perfect, but the kind that acknowledges reality without turning away from it. I live the life I live. I made the choices I made. They led me here to this quiet room, this slow morning light, this version of myself that is still somehow learning. And maybe that's enough. If you're younger, I won't tell you what to do. People don't change because someone older tells them to. But I will say this. Pay attention to the small choices, the ones that seem insignificant, the moments when you decide whether to speak or stay silent, to try or to step back, to be honest or to be agreeable. Those moments add up. They shape your life far more than the big decisions you spend so much time worrying about. Don't wait for a perfect time to become who you are. That time doesn't arrive on its own. You have to create it, often in ways that feel uncomfortable or uncertain. And yes, you might make mistakes, you probably will, but at least those mistakes will be yours, not the result of a life lived entirely by default. If you're closer to my age, then you already know much of this. You've felt it in your own way, through your own experiences. Maybe there are still things you want to say, things you've held back for years. Say them. Even if it feels late, especially if it feels late, there's a kind of freedom in that honesty that doesn't depend on how much time you have left.